The afternoon sun spilled through the tall windows of the Thornton estate, catching dust particles that danced in the air like tiny stars. It was the spring of 1952, and Mrs. Eleanor Thornton moved with purpose through her mansion, checking and rechecking every detail for tonight's charity gala. Her pearl necklace clicked softly against her collarbone as she adjusted flower arrangements and straightened already perfect table settings. "Beatrice," she called out, her voice echoing against the high ceilings. "Has the ice delivery arrived yet?" Beatrice Johnson appeared from the kitchen hallway, wiping her hands on her apron. At 43, her face showed the gentle lines of a life filled with hard work, but her eyes remained bright and alert. "Yes, ma'am. Just came in the service entrance. I've got the boys storing it now." Mrs. Thornton nodded, satisfied. "Good, and the extra glasses from downtown?" "All washed and ready." "Ma'am," Beatrice replied with the efficiency that had made her invaluable to the Thornton household for nearly 15 years. As they discussed final preparations for the evening's gathering, a small movement caught Mrs. Thornton's eye. She turned to see a young boy standing quietly in the doorway of the grand living room. He couldn't have been more than 11 or 12, with a slender build and watchful eyes that seemed to take in every detail of the room. "And who might this be?" Mrs. Thornton asked, her tone curious rather than accusatory. Beatrice turned quickly, a flash of worry crossing her face. "I'm so sorry, Mrs. Thornton, that's my Thomas. His school closed early today, broken water pipe. I couldn't find anyone to watch him on such short notice." She lowered her voice. "I promise he won't be any trouble. He's a good boy, very quiet." Mrs. Thornton studied the boy, who stood straight under her gaze. There was something about him, a seriousness perhaps, that seemed unusual for a child his age. "Well, come in properly, Thomas," Mrs. Thornton said finally. "No need to lurk in doorways." The boy stepped forward, his worn but clean shoes making no sound on the plush carpet. "Good afternoon, ma'am," he said, his voice soft but clear. "I'm sorry if I'm in the way." Mrs. Thornton raised an eyebrow, pleasantly surprised by his manners. "Not at all. Actually, you might be able to help. Can you read, Thomas?" "Yes, ma'am." "Very well, my teacher says." "Excellent. Perhaps you could help check these place cards against my guest list. Make sure every name is spelled correctly." Beatrice gave her son a small nod, and he accepted the task with a polite, "Yes, ma'am." The next few hours passed in a flurry of activity. Thomas proved himself helpful, not only checking the place cards but also assisting wherever he could, holding doors, carrying light items, and following instructions with careful attention. Mrs. Thornton noticed how he worked, alongside his mother, with a practiced ease that suggested this wasn't the first time he had helped with her work. At 4:30, the telephone rang. Beatrice answered it and then approached Mrs. Thornton with a worried expression. "It's Mr. Reynolds, ma'am. The pianist." Mrs. Thornton took the receiver, her face darkening as she listened. When she hung up, she turned to Beatrice with barely contained frustration. "Mr. Reynolds has taken ill. Claims it's his hands, arthritis acting up from the rain." She glanced at the window where sunshine continued to stream through without a cloud in sight. "More likely he got a better offer. That's the third time he's canceled on me." "What about Mrs. Peterson's son?" Beatrice suggested. "The one who played at the Christmas gathering?" "In Europe for the semester," Mrs. Thornton sighed. "And it's too late to find anyone else of quality. The guests will be arriving in 3 hours." The room fell silent as Mrs. Thornton considered her options. Proper music was essential for the atmosphere she wanted to create. These were potential donors for the children's hospital wing, and everything needed to be perfect. Thomas, who had been quietly arranging flowers in a nearby vase, cleared his throat softly. "Excuse me, ma'am." Both women turned to look at him. "I could play if you wanted. Just until your real musician comes." Mrs. Thornton blinked in surprise. "You play the piano?" Beatrice looked equally startled. "Thomas? Since when do you—" "At church, Mama," he explained, glancing at his mother. "Pastor Lewis lets me practice sometimes after Sunday service when everyone's gone home." Mrs. Thornton looked skeptical. "And what sort of pieces can you play, young man? My guests expect something a bit more sophisticated than chopsticks." Thomas didn't answer right away. His eyes drifted to the gleaming grand piano that sat in the corner of the room, an expensive Steinway that Mrs. Thornton kept mostly for show and the occasional hired performer. "May I show you?" he asked simply. Mrs. Thornton checked her watch. She still had countless details to manage before the party, but something in the boy's quiet confidence made her curious. "Very well." she agreed. A brief demonstration. Beatrice gave her son a warning look that clearly said, "Don't waste the lady's time." But Thomas moved toward the piano with unexpected confidence. He sat down carefully on the bench, adjusted its height, and positioned his hands over the keys with a naturalness that caught Mrs. Thornton's attention. Then he began to play. The opening notes of Bach's Prelude in C major filled the room, simple at first, then building into flowing arpeggios that cascaded like water. Mrs. Thornton, who had been about to turn away to continue her preparations, stopped in her tracks. The playing was not just correct, it was beautiful, controlled, expressive. Thomas's small hands moved across the keyboard with surprising dexterity, his posture perfect, his eyes half closed in concentration. As the piece progressed, Beatrice's mouth fell open in shock. She stared at her son as if seeing him for the first time. When Thomas finished the Bach piece, he transitioned seamlessly into Mozart's Turkish March, playing with a liveliness and precision that seemed impossible for someone who had never had formal training. The notes danced playfully, each one crystal clear and perfectly timed. Mrs. Thornton walked slowly to the piano, watching Thomas's fingers fly across the keys. She was no musical expert, but she had attended enough concerts to recognize exceptional talent. "Where did you learn to play like this?" she asked when he finished, unable to hide the amazement in her voice. Thomas looked down at the keys. "I listen, ma'am. At church and sometimes through the window of the music school downtown. And on your radio when Mama brings me here on school holidays." He hesitated. "The songs just stay in my head. Then I figure out how to make the same sounds." Beatrice was staring at her son with a mixture of pride and confusion. "Thomas Jefferson Johnson," she said softly. "Why didn't you tell me?" He shrugged one shoulder. "Didn't want you to worry about something we couldn't afford, Mama." The simple truth of this statement hung in the air. Piano lessons, instruments, these were luxuries far beyond what a maid's salary could provide. Mrs. Thornton's gaze moved from Thomas to the piano and back again. In all her years hosting sophisticated gatherings, she had paid handsomely for musicians who played with far less skill and feeling than this boy had just demonstrated. "Can you play anything else?" she asked. Thomas nodded. "Lots of things, ma'am. Whatever you'd like. Something appropriate for a dinner party. Chopin, perhaps?" Without hesitation, Thomas began playing Chopin's Nocturne in E-flat major. The sweet, dreamy melody flowed through the room, his interpretation remarkably mature. As he played, the butler entered to announce that the florist had arrived with the centerpieces, but Mrs. Thornton waved him silent, unwilling to interrupt the performance. When Thomas finished, the room remained quiet for a moment. "Well," Mrs. Thornton said finally, a new respect in her voice, "it seems we've found our pianist for the evening." Thomas's eyes widened. "Really, ma'am? You'd let me play for your guests? Unless you have other engagements this evening," Mrs. Thornton said with the hint of a smile. "No, ma'am." Thomas's face lit up with excitement before he quickly composed himself. "I mean, I would be honored." Beatrice stepped forward, concern on her face. "Mrs. Thornton, are you sure? Your guests. They might not." The unspoken concern hung in the air. In 1952, having a young black boy as the featured musician at an exclusive society gathering was unconventional, to say the least. Mrs. Thornton considered this, then squared her shoulders. "My guests come to my home to enjoy beauty and excellence, Beatrice. That's precisely what your son offers." She turned to Thomas. "Though we should find you something appropriate to wear." Within the hour, Thomas was dressed in a borrowed suit from the gardener's son, a bit too large but carefully pinned by Beatrice to look presentable. Mrs. Thornton had him run through a selection of pieces, creating a program that would provide elegant background music during the reception and dinner, followed by more complex pieces for after-dinner entertainment. As the first guests began to arrive, Thomas sat at the piano, his nervousness visible only in the way he repeatedly flexed his fingers. Mrs. Thornton paused beside him on her way to greet her guests. "Remember what I told you," she said quietly. "You belong at this piano as much as anyone I've ever hired. More, in fact." Thomas nodded, drawing a deep breath. "And Thomas," she added, "after tonight we should discuss your future. Talent like yours deserves proper training." Before he could respond, she moved away to welcome her guests, leaving Thomas staring after her in wonder. As the room began to fill with elegant strangers in expensive clothes, he turned to the piano keys beneath his fingers, the one place in this grand house where he felt certain of himself. Then, as the buzz of conversation grew around him, Thomas began to play, his music rising above the chatter like a bird finding its voice for the first time. The Thornton mansion buzzed with the gentle hum of conversation as elegantly dressed guests mingled in the grand ballroom. Crystal glasses clinked, pearls gleamed under the chandeliers, and the subtle scent of expensive perfume hung in the air. In the corner, Thomas sat at the grand piano, his fingers dancing across the keys as he played a delicate Mozart piece. Though his borrowed suit was slightly too large and his shoes had been hastily polished, his music transformed him into something more than just a maid's son. Mrs. Thornton moved gracefully among her guests, accepting compliments on the evening's arrangements with practiced charm. Several times she noticed people pausing mid-conversation, their attention caught by the music flowing from the corner of the room. "Eleanor, darling," said Mrs. Pembroke, a silver-haired woman dripping with diamonds, "wherever did you find this pianist?" "He's absolutely marvelous," Mrs. Thornton smiled. "He's something of a recent discovery." "Well, he puts that dreadful man you usually hire to shame," Mrs. Pembroke declared. "So much feeling in his playing." "Is he from the conservatory?" Before Mrs. Thornton could answer, Dr. William Hayes, the head of the hospital board and the evening's guest of honor, joined their conversation. "I was just wondering the same thing," he said, his eyes drifting toward Thomas. "That's Debussy he's playing now, and Claire de Lune, and with remarkable interpretation for one so young." Mrs. Thornton hesitated only briefly. "The young man is Thomas Johnson, Beatrice's son." "Beatrice, your maid?" Mrs. Pembroke's eyebrows shot up toward her hairline. "Yes," Mrs. Thornton replied evenly. "And it appears her son is something of a musical prodigy." Dr. Hayes tilted his head, listening more intently. "Self-taught, I presume?" Mrs. Thornton nodded. "As far as I know. Today was the first I'd heard him play." "Extraordinary," Dr. Hayes murmured. "Absolutely extraordinary." As the evening progressed and dinner was served, Thomas continued to play, moving smoothly from classical pieces to lighter, more contemporary tunes. Each time he finished a piece, a smattering of applause would break out among the guests. Thomas acknowledged this with a shy nod before continuing, his focus unwavering. In the kitchen, Beatrice worked alongside the hired catering staff, helping to prepare and serve the elaborate meal. Every so often, she would pause near the doorway, listening to her son's music with an expression of wonder on her face. "That's your boy?" asked one of the caterers, a middle-aged woman named Florence. Beatrice nodded, unable to keep the pride from her face. "Yes, that's my Thomas. Where'd he learn to play like that?" "I wish I knew," Beatrice said softly. "All this time, he never said a word about it." As dessert was being served, Mrs. Thornton approached the piano during a brief pause between songs. "You're doing wonderfully, Thomas," she said quietly. "How are you feeling? Would you like a break? Something to eat?" Thomas shook his head. "I'm fine, ma'am. I could keep playing all night." His eyes were bright with excitement, his earlier nervousness completely gone. "Well, I have a special request if you're up to it," Mrs. Thornton said. "After dessert, I'd like you to play something more substantial. A showpiece, you might say." Thomas straightened on the bench. "What did you have in mind?" "Do you know any Chopin? Perhaps one of the etudes?" A slow smile spread across Thomas's face. "Yes, ma'am. I know several." Mrs. Thornton patted his shoulder. "Excellent. When I give you the signal, you can begin." After dessert had been cleared away and coffee served, Mrs. Thornton clinked her spoon against her crystal glass, calling for attention. The room fell silent as she stood. "Ladies and gentlemen, I want to thank you all for coming tonight. Your generosity will help ensure that the new children's wing at City Hospital becomes a reality." She paused as a round of applause circulated through the room. "Now, I'd like to offer a special musical interlude. Many of you have commented on our young pianist this evening. I'm pleased to introduce Thomas Johnson, who will now perform Chopin's Revolutionary Etude." A curious murmur rippled through the crowd as all eyes turned toward the piano. Thomas took a deep breath, flexed his fingers, and began to play. From the first explosive cascade of notes, it was clear this was no ordinary performance. The technically demanding piece required incredible dexterity and control, which Thomas delivered with astonishing skill. His small hand stretched and flew across the keyboard, bringing forth the storm of emotion that Chopin had poured into the composition. In the kitchen doorway, Beatrice stood transfixed, her hand pressed against her heart. Florence stood beside her, both women watching as Thomas's music filled the mansion with power and passion. "Did you know?" Florence whispered. "Did you know he could do this?" Beatrice shook her head, tears welling in her eyes. "No," she whispered back. "I had no idea." In the ballroom, the guests sat motionless, many with expressions of disbelief on their faces. Mrs. Pembroke had her hand pressed to her mouth. Dr. Hayes leaned forward in his chair, his brow furrowed in concentration. Mrs. Thornton stood near the piano, watching Thomas with a look of triumph. As Thomas approached the finale, his whole body became part of the music, his face intense with concentration, his shoulders rising and falling with each dramatic phrase. When he struck the final chords, the room remained perfectly silent for several seconds, before erupting into enthusiastic applause. Thomas stood and gave a small, awkward bow, his face flushed with exertion and emotion. Several guests rose to their feet, the applause growing louder. "Bravo!" called Dr. Hayes. "Bravo, young man." Mrs. Thornton beckoned Thomas to join her. Hesitantly, he made his way through the crowd, acutely aware of all eyes upon him. "Ladies and gentlemen," Mrs. Thornton announced, placing a hand on Thomas's shoulder, "I believe we have witnessed something quite remarkable this evening, a natural talent of the highest order." "Where did you study, young man?" asked an elderly gentleman near the front. Thomas glanced at Mrs. Thornton before answering. "I haven't had any formal lessons, sir. I just play what I hear." This revelation caused another stir among the guests. "No lessons?" Mrs. Pembroke exclaimed. "Impossible." "It's true," Mrs. Thornton confirmed. "Thomas has had no formal training. What you heard tonight is pure natural talent." Dr. Hayes stepped forward, addressing Thomas directly. "Son, do you know what perfect pitch is?" Thomas shook his head. "It's the ability to identify or reproduce any musical note without a reference tone. It's quite rare." Dr. Hayes turned to the room. "My wife is a professor at the conservatory. She tests for this ability." He turned back to Thomas. "Would you mind a small experiment?" Thomas looked nervous but nodded his agreement. Dr. Hayes walked to the piano and struck a key with his back turned so Thomas couldn't see which one he had played. "Can you tell me what note that is?" "E-flat," Thomas answered without hesitation. Dr. Hayes struck another key. "And this?" "I was after 5 more notes, all correctly identified." Dr. Hayes turned to the astonished crowd. "Perfect pitch, without question, and combined with his natural ability to reproduce what he hears." He shook his head in amazement. "In my 40 years as a patron of the arts, I have never encountered such raw talent." From the doorway, Beatrice watched with a mixture of pride and apprehension. Florence squeezed her arm supportively. "Would you play something else for us, Thomas?" asked a young woman near the front. "Something you particularly enjoy?" Thomas looked to Mrs. Thornton, who nodded encouragingly. "There is one piece," he said softly. "I heard it on the radio last year. It stayed with me." He returned to the piano and, after a moment's concentration, began to play Rachmaninoff's Piano Concerto No. 2. The rich, romantic melody filled the room, building in complexity as Thomas played not just the piano part, but somehow suggested the orchestra as well, his left hand providing the lush harmonies while his right brought forth the soaring melody. As he played, Dr. Hayes made his way over to Mrs. Thornton. "This boy needs proper training," he said urgently. "It would be nothing short of criminal to let such talent go undeveloped." Mrs. Thornton nodded. "I was thinking the same thing." "The conservatory has a scholarship program," Dr. Hayes continued. "Limited, of course, and quite competitive, but with talent like this, would his background be an issue?" Mrs. Thornton asked directly. Dr. Hayes understood her meaning immediately. There would be challenges, but music should transcend such barriers, shouldn't it? "Should, yes," Mrs. Thornton replied. "But does it?" Before Dr. Hayes could answer, Thomas concluded the piece, and once again the room filled with applause. This time everyone stood. After taking another shy bow, Thomas made his way through the crowd toward the kitchen where his mother waited. Beatrice pulled him into a tight hug regardless of the curious onlookers. "Why didn't you tell me?" she whispered into his ear. Thomas pulled back, looking at her with earnest eyes. "You work so hard, Mama, I didn't want to be another worry." Beatrice touched his face gently. You could never be a worry. But this gift of yours, it's something special, something rare. Mrs. Thornton said the same thing, Thomas replied. She mentioned something about my future. Beatrice glanced toward the ballroom where Mrs. Thornton was in deep conversation with Dr. Hayes. Did she now? Later, as the last guests were departing, Mrs. Thornton found Beatrice and Thomas in the kitchen. Thomas was helping to wash dishes, his suit jacket removed and his sleeves rolled up. Thomas, Mrs. Thornton said, I'd like you and your mother to come to my study tomorrow afternoon. There's something important I'd like to discuss with both of you. Thomas looked at his mother questioningly. We'll be here, ma'am, Beatrice replied, her voice steady despite the uncertainty in her eyes. As they left the mansion that night, walking the long route back to their small apartment on the other side of town, Thomas kept replaying the evening in his mind. The music, the applause, the looks of amazement on the guests' faces. Mama, he said finally, do you think Mrs. Thornton might let me play her piano again sometime? Beatrice looked down at her son, seeing him as if for the first time. Not just as her boy, but as someone with extraordinary gifts, someone whose life might take paths she had never imagined possible. I think, Thomas, she said carefully, that after tonight a lot of things might change for you. They walked on in silence, the echoes of Thomas's music still resonating in both their minds, opening doors to possibilities that had seemed impossible just one day before. The following afternoon, Thomas fidgeted with his collar as he sat beside his mother on the edge of a leather chair in Mrs. Thornton's study. The room smelled of old books and furniture polish, with walls lined with shelves of leather-bound volumes that Thomas longed to touch. A large desk dominated the space, its surface neat and organized with a few papers stacked precisely in the corner. Mrs. Thornton sat across from them, her posture perfect as always. She had greeted them with unusual warmth when they arrived, even offering Thomas a glass of lemonade, which now sat untouched on the small table beside him. First, Mrs. Thornton began, I want to thank you both for yesterday evening. Thomas, your playing was extraordinary. My guests haven't stopped calling to tell me how impressed they were. Thank you, ma'am, Thomas replied quietly, his eyes darting up briefly before returning to his hands folded in his lap. I've invited you here today because I believe we're at an important crossroads. Mrs. Thornton leaned forward slightly. Thomas has a gift, a rare and precious gift that deserves proper nurturing. Beatrice shifted in her seat. That's very kind of you to say, ma'am. It's not kindness, Beatrice, it's simple truth. Mrs. Thornton's tone was matter-of-fact. Your son possesses exceptional musical talent, and I believe it would be nothing short of a tragedy to let it go undeveloped. Thomas looked up, his eyes wide with hope and uncertainty. Mrs. Thornton continued. Dr. Hayes, you remember him from last night, the gentleman who tested your perfect pitch, is on the board of the Westland Conservatory of Music. He's arranged for an audition next week with the director, Professor Richardson. Beatrice's breath caught. The Westland Conservatory was the most prestigious music school in the city, perhaps in the entire state. Its students came from wealthy families and went on to perform in famous orchestras around the world. That's very generous, Beatrice managed to say. But I'm afraid we couldn't possibly afford. The conservatory offers scholarships, Mrs. Thornton interrupted smoothly. Not many, and they're highly competitive. But for talent like Thomas's, she let the implication hang in the air. A scholarship? Thomas whispered, sitting up straighter. If you pass the audition, and I have every confidence you will, the scholarship would cover tuition, materials, and weekly private lessons. Mrs. Thornton turned her attention directly to Thomas. But you should understand what this means. It would require serious commitment. Hours of daily practice, theory lessons, music history. Thomas nodded eagerly. I would work hard, ma'am. Harder than anyone. Mrs. Thornton smiled slightly. I believe you would. She turned back to Beatrice. Of course there would be. Challenges. The conservatory has never had a colored student before. Beatrice's face tightened. This was the reality. She had lived with her entire life. The barriers she had warned Thomas about since he was old enough to understand. Yes, ma'am, I imagine there would be. Dr. Hayes assures me that Professor Richardson is a fair man who cares only about music, not about. Mrs. Thornton waved her hand vaguely. Other matters, but I won't pretend it would be easy. Thomas looked at his mother, his eyes pleading. Beatrice felt her heart constrict. She wanted to protect her son from pain and disappointment, from the harsh realities she knew awaited him in a world that often judged people first by the color of their skin. But she also recognized the fire in his eyes, the same determination she'd seen when he taught himself to read before kindergarten, when he insisted on walking to the library alone every Saturday to borrow books, when he stayed up late helping her with her mending so she could rest her tired hands. What would this mean for Thomas's regular schooling? Beatrice asked, her practical nature asserting itself. An excellent question, Mrs. Thornton replied. The conservatory offers academic classes in the mornings, with music instruction in the afternoons. Their education standards are quite high. Many students go on to universities. University. The word hung in the air like an impossible dream. No one in Beatrice's family had ever gone beyond high school. May I ask why you're doing this, ma'am? Beatrice asked suddenly. The question had been burning inside her since they sat down. Mrs. Thornton didn't answer immediately. She rose from her chair and walked to the window, looking out at her carefully tended garden for a long moment before turning back. My brother was a pianist, she said finally. Quite talented, though perhaps not as naturally gifted as your son. Our parents didn't support his musical ambitions. They wanted him to join our father's law firm. A shadow passed over her face. He gave up music to please them, went to law school, became a partner in the family business, and was miserable his entire adult life. She walked back to her chair but didn't sit. When he died 5 years ago, I found stacks of sheet music in his home, pieces he had purchased but never played, an entire room dedicated to the passion he had abandoned. She looked directly at Thomas. True talent is rare, Beatrice. When we encounter it, we have a responsibility to nurture it, not squander it. Beatrice studied Mrs. Thornton's face, seeing something she hadn't noticed before, a genuine emotion beneath the polished exterior. The audition is next Tuesday at 4 o'clock, Mrs. Thornton continued. Thomas can practice here every day after school until then. I've already spoken with Professor Richardson. He's intrigued. And if Thomas gets the scholarship? Beatrice asked. What then? Then he begins classes in September. Mrs. Thornton sat down again. Your work schedule would need adjustment. I can arrange for you to have afternoons off to take him to his lessons, with a corresponding adjustment to your salary, of course. Beatrice felt a wave of gratitude and something else, a cautious hope she hardly dared to acknowledge. Thomas? Mrs. Thornton turned her attention to the boy. This must be your decision as well. It would mean hard work, challenges, and possibly unkindness from some quarters. Thomas sat up straight, his young face suddenly serious beyond his years. Music is like breathing to me, ma'am. When I play, I feel complete, like I've found what I'm meant to do. He glanced at his mother. I want to try, if Mama agrees. All eyes turned to Beatrice. She looked at her son, this child who had always been different, always watching, listening, absorbing everything around him. She remembered finding him as a toddler, pressing his ear against their landlady's door when she played her old records, his tiny body swaying in perfect time to music he couldn't even see the source of. Yes, she said finally. We'll try. The next few days passed in a blur of activity. Each afternoon, Thomas rushed from school to the Thornton mansion, where he was allowed to practice on the grand piano for hours. Mrs. Thornton arranged for sheet music to be delivered, Bach preludes, Mozart sonatas, Chopin etudes, though Thomas rarely needed to look at the notes for long before he could play from memory. On the third day, Mrs. Thornton invited Dr. Hayes to listen to Thomas play and offer advice for the audition. You'll need to demonstrate range, Dr. Hayes explained after Thomas had played several pieces. Show them you can handle different styles, periods, and technical challenges. Thomas nodded seriously, taking mental notes of everything Dr. Hayes suggested. And they'll test your sight-reading abilities, Dr. Hayes continued. They'll give you a piece you've never seen before and ask you to play it. I can do that, Thomas said confidently. Dr. Hayes smiled. I believe you can. But remember, technical skill is only part of what they're looking for. They want to see your passion for music, your understanding of what you're playing. How do I show that? Thomas asked. By feeling the music, not just playing the notes. Dr. Hayes sat beside Thomas on the piano bench. Let me show you something. He played a simple melody with his right hand. That's correct, technically. Now listen to this. He played the same melody again, but with subtle differences in timing and emphasis that suddenly brought the simple tune to life. Thomas watched intently, then repeated the passage exactly as Dr. Hayes had played it. Capturing every nuance, Dr. Hayes blinked in surprise. Well, I'd say you understand perfectly. On the day before the audition, Beatrice found Thomas sitting alone at the kitchen table in their small apartment, staring at his hands. What's troubling you, son? She asked, sitting across from him. What if I'm not good enough? He whispered. What if I disappoint everyone? Beatrice reached across the table and took his hands in hers. They were different now from the baby hands she'd once held, longer, stronger, with calluses forming on the fingertips from hours of practice. Thomas Jefferson Johnson, she said firmly, using his full name as she did only in moments of importance. You listen to me. You have been given a gift that no one can take away from you. Whether these people at the fancy music school recognize it or not doesn't change that fact. Thomas nodded, but doubt still clouded his eyes. Remember what your father used to say? Beatrice continued, her voice softening at the mention of the man who had died when Thomas was only 4. The only true failure is not trying. Thomas recited, that's right. Beatrice squeezed his hands. Whatever happens tomorrow, I am already proud of you. And your father would be too. The next afternoon, Mrs. Thornton's driver took Thomas, Beatrice, and Mrs. Thornton herself to the Westland Conservatory. The imposing stone building with its tall columns made Thomas's stomach tighten with nerves. Students in crisp uniforms walked the grounds, carrying instrument cases and stacks of sheet music. They stared openly at Thomas as he passed. In the waiting room outside the audition hall, Thomas sat between his mother and Mrs. Thornton, his best church clothes freshly pressed, his shoes polished to a mirror shine. Other children waited with their parents, mostly boys around Thomas's age, all dressed in expensive clothes, all clutching sheet music or instruments. A few whispered behind their hands as they glanced at Thomas. Remember, Mrs. Thornton said quietly, you've earned your place here as much as any of them. Before Thomas could respond, a stern-looking woman opened the door and called his name. Thomas Johnson. Professor Richardson will see you now. Thomas stood, his legs suddenly wobbly. Beatrice straightened his collar one last time and whispered, just play like you do at home. Like the music is just for you. Thomas nodded, took a deep breath, and followed the woman into the audition room. The heavy door closed behind him with a final-sounding click. The audition room was larger than Thomas had expected, with a high ceiling and gleaming hardwood floors. At its center stood a magnificent concert grand piano, bigger than Mrs. Thornton's. At a table near the wall sat 3 people, an elderly man with bushy white eyebrows, a middle-aged woman with her hair pulled into a severe bun, and in the center a tall, thin man whom Thomas immediately recognized as Professor Richardson from Mrs. Thornton's description. Good afternoon. Young man, Professor Richardson said, his voice neither warm nor cold. Please, introduce yourself and tell us what you'll be playing for us today. Thomas stood before the 3 judges, his heart hammering against his ribs. The polished concert grand piano gleamed under the bright lights, somehow looking both inviting and intimidating at the same time. My name is Thomas Johnson, he said, his voice steadier than he felt. I'll be playing Bach's Prelude in C minor, followed by Chopin's Revolutionary Etude and a piece of Debussy's Clair de Lune. The woman with the severe bun raised her eyebrows. That's quite an ambitious program for someone your age. Thomas swallowed hard but met her gaze. Yes, ma'am. Professor Richardson made a note on the paper in front of him. We understand you've had no formal training. Is that correct? Yes, sir. I taught myself by listening. The elderly man with bushy eyebrows leaned forward. And how long have you been playing? Thomas thought for a moment. As long as I can remember, sir. But on a real piano only when I could find one. At church sometimes, or... He hesitated, then added, At Mrs. Thornton's house this past week. The three judges exchanged glances. Professor Richardson nodded toward the piano. Well then, let's hear what you can do. Thomas approached the magnificent instrument, adjusting the bench carefully. He placed his hands on the keys, feeling their cool smoothness beneath his fingertips. He closed his eyes for just a moment, letting the world around him fade away until there was only himself and the music waiting to be released. Then he began to play. The Bach prelude flowed from his fingers with precision and clarity, each note distinct yet connected to form a seamless whole. Thomas felt himself relaxing as the familiar patterns took shape, his body moving naturally with the rhythm and flow of the music. When he finished the first piece, he paused only briefly before launching into Chopin's technically demanding etude. His small hands stretched and flew across the keyboard, bringing forth cascades of notes that filled the large room with sound. The piece was a storm of emotion, and Thomas poured himself into it completely, forgetting his nervousness, forgetting the stern faces watching him, forgetting everything except the music itself. As the final chords of the Chopin piece faded, Thomas noticed that the woman with the severe bun was now leaning forward, her earlier skepticism replaced by intense interest. The elderly man had removed his glasses and was wiping them absently, his eyes never leaving Thomas. Professor Richardson's expression remained unreadable, but his pen had stopped moving across his notepad. Thomas took a deep breath and began the Debussy piece, his touch becoming lighter, more delicate. Clair de Lune was like painting with sound, creating impressions of moonlight and water with subtle shifts in tone and timing. Thomas played it not as he had heard others perform it, but as he felt it should be, with a dreamlike quality that seemed to suspend time. When he finished, the room was absolutely silent. Professor Richardson cleared his throat. That was most impressive, Mr. Johnson. He exchanged glances with his colleagues before continuing. We'd like to test your sight-reading abilities now. The woman with the severe bun rose and approached the piano with a piece of sheet music, which she placed on the stand. Thomas glanced at it, a piece he'd never seen before with complex rhythms and key changes. This is an excerpt from Schumann's Kinderscenen, she explained. Take a moment to look it over, then play it as best you can. Thomas studied the music carefully, his eyes moving quickly over the notes, his fingers twitching slightly as he mentally rehearsed the passages. After about 30 seconds, he began to play. He navigated the unfamiliar piece with remarkable confidence, capturing not just the notes but the spirit of Schumann's Scenes from Childhood. When he made a small mistake in one measure, he recovered so smoothly that it hardly registered as an error. That will do, Professor Richardson said when Thomas finished. Now I'd like to test something else, and he walked to the piano and played a complex chord.
Can you identify these notes?
Thomas listened intently. E flat, G, B flat, D, and F sharp on top. He answered without hesitation. Professor Richardson played another chord, this one even more complex. A C sharp, E, G, B flat, and D, Thomas replied. After several more tests of Thomas's ear, the elderly man spoke up. I believe we've heard enough to make our decision. He turned to his colleagues. Unless either of you has additional questions? The woman shook her head and Professor Richardson stood. Thank you, Mr. Johnson. You may wait outside while we deliberate. Thomas nodded politely and made his way to the door, his legs suddenly shaky as the tension of the audition caught up with him. As he stepped into the waiting area, Beatrice and Mrs. Thornton rose to meet him. How did it go? Beatrice asked anxiously. Thomas took a deep breath. I played my best, Mama. They didn't say much. Mrs. Thornton placed a reassuring hand on his shoulder. That's often a good sign. When critics have nothing to criticize, they tend to fall silent. They sat down again to wait. The other children and their parents had all gone, leaving the three of them alone in the large, echoing space. Minutes stretched into what felt like hours. Thomas found himself counting the tiles on the floor, trying to distract himself from the knot of anxiety in his stomach. Finally, the door opened, and Professor Richardson emerged. His face was as unreadable as it had been during the audition. Mrs. Johnson, Mrs. Thornton, he acknowledged with a slight bow. I'd like to speak with you both, along with young Thomas here. Would you please follow me to my office? They followed him down a long hallway lined with photographs of orchestras and distinguished-looking musicians. Professor Richardson's office was smaller than Thomas had expected, with books and sheet music stacked on nearly every surface. He gestured for them to sit in the 3 chairs arranged before his desk. "First," he said once they were seated, "I want to be clear that what we witnessed today was quite extraordinary." He looked directly at Thomas. "Your natural ability is remarkable, particularly given your lack of formal training." Thomas felt a surge of hope, but Professor Richardson's next words dampened it immediately. "However, the Westland Conservatory has certain traditions, standards that have been in place since its founding 80 years ago." Beatrice stiffened beside Thomas, her hands clasping tightly in her lap. Mrs. Thornton's expression hardened slightly. "I understand, Professor," Mrs. Thornton said coolly. "But surely tradition must occasionally yield to exceptional circumstances." Professor Richardson sighed. "That is precisely the question we've been debating. Mrs. Thornton, the conservatory has never admitted a colored student before." "Then perhaps it's time that changed," Mrs. Thornton replied. Professor Richardson studied her for a moment before turning his attention to Beatrice. "Mrs. Johnson, may I ask what your aspirations are for your son?" Beatrice straightened in her chair. "I want what any mother wants, for my child to have the chance to develop his gifts and make something of himself. And if that path is difficult, if he faces resistance and perhaps worse—"
"My son has faced difficulties since the day he was born," Beatrice answered firmly.
"But running from challenges has never been our family's way." Professor Richardson nodded slowly, then turned to Thomas. "And you, young man, are you prepared for what might lie ahead if you were to join us here?" Thomas thought carefully before answering. "Sir, when I play music, nothing else matters. Not who I am or what I look like or what others think of me, just the music." He paused. "If you'll teach me, I'll work harder than anyone has ever worked before." A slight smile crossed Professor Richardson's face, the first they had seen. "That," he said, "I do not doubt." He leaned back in his chair. "The scholarship committee was unanimous in its assessment of your musical ability. You are, without question, the most naturally gifted pianist we have auditioned in many years." He reached into his desk drawer and withdrew a folder. "Which is why we have decided to offer you a full scholarship to the Westland Conservatory, beginning this September." Thomas's mouth fell open. Beatrice gasped softly beside him. Mrs. Thornton's face broke into a triumphant smile. "Really?" Thomas whispered. "You mean it?" "I never say things I don't mean, young man," Professor Richardson replied. "But I must be honest, your path here will not be easy. There will be those who question your presence, who believe you don't belong. They'll change their minds when they hear him play," Mrs. Thornton interjected. "Some will," Professor Richardson agreed. "Others may not, regardless of his talent." He looked at Thomas again. "You would be a pioneer here, Mr. Johnson. That's never a comfortable position." Thomas nodded solemnly. "I understand, sir." Professor Richardson handed the folder to Beatrice. "These are the scholarship papers, along with information about the academic year, required materials, and the conservatory's code of conduct. Classes begin on September 15th. Beatrice took the folder with trembling hands. "Thank you, Professor." "Don't thank me yet, Mrs. Johnson," Professor Richardson replied. "Thank me when your son graduates." He rose, indicating the meeting was over. "I suggest Thomas continue practicing daily. He'll be assigned a primary instructor once the term begins." As they left the conservatory building, Thomas felt as though he were floating a few inches above the ground. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the manicured lawn, and the stone buildings seemed to glow with golden light. "We did it, Mama," he whispered, squeezing his mother's hand. Beatrice squeezed back, her eyes shining with unshed tears. "You did it, Thomas. You and that wonderful gift of yours." Mrs. Thornton smiled at them both. "This calls for a celebration. Dinner at Willow's restaurant, I think." Thomas's eyes widened. Willow's was the fanciest restaurant in town, a place neither he nor his mother had ever been. "Oh, Mrs. Thornton, that's too much," Beatrice protested. "Nonsense. Every great achievement deserves recognition." Mrs. Thornton's tone left no room for argument as she led them toward her waiting car. That evening, seated in a private dining room at Willow's with gleaming silverware and crystal glasses before him, Thomas tried to absorb everything that had happened. Just a week ago, he had been a normal boy. Well, normal except for the music that constantly filled his head. Now he was a scholarship student at the Westland Conservatory, dining in a restaurant where most of the staff looked like his mother but none of the customers did. As Mrs. Thornton and his mother discussed practical matters, his school schedule, transportation arrangements, what he would need for classes, Thomas found his thoughts drifting to the future. What would it be like to study music every day? To be surrounded by others who shared his passion? To learn from real masters? Thomas? Mrs. Thornton's voice brought him back to the present. You're very quiet. Are you all right? He nodded quickly. Yes, ma'am. Just thinking. About what, dear? His mother asked. Thomas tried to find the right words for the mixture of excitement and fear swirling inside him. About how fast things can change. Last week I was just Beatrice's son who helped out sometimes. Now I'm... He trailed off, unsure how to continue. You're still Beatrice's son, Mrs. Thornton said firmly. You're just Beatrice's son who happens to be an extraordinarily gifted pianist with a bright future ahead of him. Beatrice reached over to straighten Thomas's collar, a familiar gesture that comforted him. Whatever happens next, she said softly, we'll face it together, just like we always have. Thomas smiled at his mother, drawing strength from her steady presence. Then he looked at Mrs. Thornton, this woman who had changed their lives with a simple request to play her piano. Thank you, he said simply. For hearing me, Mrs. Thornton's eyes softened. Thank you, Thomas, for reminding me of what truly matters in this world. As they finished their meal, Thomas felt something new taking root inside him. Not just hope for his own future, but a sense that perhaps he could open doors for others as well. If music could bridge the gap between a wealthy white woman, her black maid, and a boy with a gift, what other boundaries might it cross? Outside the restaurant, the first stars were appearing in the twilight sky. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, but tonight Thomas allowed himself to simply bask in the glow of possibility. 10 years later, the grand ballroom of the Thornton mansion was filled to capacity. Elegant guests in formal attire mingled beneath the crystal chandeliers, their excited conversations creating a gentle hum that filled the space. The occasion was Mrs. Eleanor Thornton's 70th birthday, though the guest of honor insisted the evening was about something far more important than her age. In the corner of the room stood the same Steinway grand piano where, a decade earlier, a young boy had first revealed his extraordinary gift. Tonight, that piano was the centerpiece of the gathering, surrounded by chairs arranged in neat semicircles. Beatrice Johnson moved efficiently through the crowd, supervising the catering staff with the quiet authority she had developed over her years as the Thornton household's head of staff. Her hair now showed streaks of silver, but she carried herself with the same dignity and grace she always had, perhaps with even more confidence than before. As she passed near the entrance, she paused to straighten a floral arrangement and caught sight of a tall young man entering the mansion. At 21, Thomas Johnson had grown into his lanky frame. He wore a perfectly tailored tuxedo, his posture straight and assured as he greeted several guests who immediately recognized him. Thomas, Beatrice called out, momentarily forgetting her professional reserve. She hurried to embrace her son, whom she hadn't seen in nearly 6 months. Mama, Thomas said warmly, hugging her tightly. You look wonderful. As do you, she replied, stepping back to admire him. Paris clearly agrees with you, Thomas smiled. It's been an amazing experience, but I've missed home. He glanced around the familiar room. How is she? Beatrice's expression grew more serious. Good days and bad. Today is one of the better ones. She's been looking forward to this evening for weeks. As have I, Thomas said. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small wrapped package. I brought something for her. She'll be down shortly, Beatrice said, checking her watch. The guests are nearly all here, Thomas nodded. I'll go up and see her if that's all right. Of course. You know the way. Thomas made his way through the crowd, accepting congratulations and well wishes from many who had followed his career over the years. He climbed the grand staircase and walked down the familiar hallway to Mrs. Thornton's private sitting room, where he knocked gently on the door. Come in, called a voice that was thinner than he remembered but still carried the unmistakable tone of authority. Thomas entered to find Mrs. Thornton seated by the window. Age had diminished her physically. She was smaller now, more fragile, but her eyes were as sharp and intelligent as ever. She wore an elegant blue evening gown, her silver hair arranged perfectly, pearls gleaming at her neck and wrists. Thomas, she said, her face lighting up. "You've arrived." "I wouldn't have missed this for the world," he replied, crossing the room to take her outstretched hands. He leaned down to kiss her cheek. "Happy birthday, Mrs. Thornton." "Eleanor," she corrected him with a smile. "After all these years, I think we're well past formalities, don't you?" Thomas smiled. "Old habits. How are you feeling?" "Oh, well enough to enjoy my own party," she said dismissively, though Thomas noticed the medicine bottles lined up on the side table. "But never mind that. Tell me about Paris, about the competition." Thomas took a seat across from her. "It was everything you said it would be. The most challenging experience of my life." "And yet you triumphed," Mrs. Thornton said, her voice filled with pride. "First place at the International Chopin competition. When I read the telegram, I nearly fainted from joy." Thomas laughed. "Somehow I doubt that. Nothing has ever made you faint?" "Well, perhaps not," she conceded with a twinkle in her eye. "But I was exceedingly pleased." She studied him carefully. "And now? What comes next?" "The New York Philharmonic has offered me a position as a featured soloist for their upcoming season," Thomas said. "And there's talk of a European tour next year." Mrs. Thornton nodded approvingly. "As it should be. The world deserves to hear you play." She paused, her expression growing more thoughtful.
And have you given any more consideration to my suggestion?
Thomas knew exactly what she was referring to. For the past year, Mrs. Thornton had been encouraging him to establish a music foundation for gifted children from disadvantaged backgrounds. "I have," he said, reaching into his pocket for the small package he had brought. "In fact, that's what this is about." Mrs. Thornton accepted the package and unwrapped it carefully to reveal a small velvet box. Inside was an antique silver key. "What's this?" she asked, looking up at him in confusion. "The key to my future," Thomas replied, "and hopefully to the futures of many others." He took a deep breath. "I've decided to accept your offer. The building on Maple Street will make a perfect home for the Thomas Johnson Foundation for Musical Excellence." Mrs. Thornton's eyes filled with tears, a rare display of emotion from a woman who prided herself on self-control. "You've made an old woman very happy, Thomas." "I've drawn up preliminary plans," he continued. "Scholarships for students who couldn't otherwise afford lessons, master classes with visiting musicians, community concerts." His eyes shone with enthusiasm. "A place where talent matters more than background or circumstances." "Just as it should be," Mrs. Thornton murmured. A gentle knock at the door interrupted them. Beatrice peeked in. "I'm sorry to disturb you, but the guests are all seated. They're waiting for the guest of honor and the performer." Mrs. Thornton nodded. "We'll be right down." As Beatrice helped Mrs. Thornton to her feet, Thomas offered his arm for additional support. Together, the three of them made their way slowly down the grand staircase. The assembled guests rose as Mrs. Thornton entered the ballroom, applauding warmly. Dr. Hayes, now well into his 80s but still sharp-minded, stood at the center of the room. "Ladies and gentlemen," he announced, "it is my great privilege to welcome you all to this celebration of Eleanor Thornton's 70th birthday. But as she has reminded me repeatedly," this earned a chuckle from the crowd, "this evening is less about honoring her years than it is about celebrating a journey that began in this very room a decade ago." He gestured toward Thomas. "Many of you know the remarkable story of Thomas Johnson, who has recently returned from Paris as the youngest winner of the International Chopin competition in its history. What you may not know is that Thomas's journey began right here, at that piano, when Mrs. Thornton's regular pianist canceled at the last minute." Murmurs of appreciation rippled through the crowd as Thomas guided Mrs. Thornton to a seat of honor in the front row, next to his mother. Dr. Hayes continued, "Tonight, we have the privilege of hearing Thomas perform a special piece, one he has composed specifically for this occasion, dedicated to Mrs. Thornton and to his mother, Beatrice Johnson, whose unwavering support made his journey possible." Thomas took his place at the piano, adjusting the bench just as he had done thousands of times before. He looked out at the assembled guests, his eyes finding his mother and Mrs. Thornton sitting side by side in the front row, one who had given him life and unconditional love, the other who had given him opportunity and unwavering belief in his talent. Two women from entirely different worlds united by their faith in him. "The piece I'm about to play," Thomas said, his clear voice carrying throughout the room, "is called Bridges. It tells the story of connections formed across divisions that once seemed uncrossable. It's about the power of music to transform lives, not just mine but many others. He placed his hands on the keys and began to play. The music started simply, with a melancholy melody that spoke of struggle and longing. Gradually, it evolved into something more complex and hopeful, building toward a triumphant middle section that made several audience members dab at their eyes. As Thomas played, he remembered the journey that had brought him to this moment. The first day he'd touched this very piano, the audition at the conservatory, the challenges of being the only black student in his class, the triumphs that followed as his talent won over even the most reluctant critics, his graduation with highest honors, and finally, his breakthrough on the international stage. The music reflected all of this, the difficulties, the breakthroughs, the moments of pure joy when nothing existed except the perfect communion between artist and instrument. But it also told a larger story, one about breaking barriers and creating new possibilities. As the piece neared its conclusion, Thomas incorporated subtle elements of spirituals his mother had sung to him as a child, weaving them into the classical framework in a way that honored both traditions. The final section resolved into a peaceful, hopeful theme that lingered in the air, even after his fingers left the keys. For a moment, the room was completely silent. Then, as one, the audience rose to their feet in thunderous applause. Thomas stood and bowed, his eyes seeking out his mother and Mrs. Thornton. Both women were crying unashamedly now, their hands clasped together. When the applause finally subsided, Thomas spoke again. 10 years ago, a rich lady asked her maid's son to play the piano. Not knowing he smiled self-deprecatingly. Well, not knowing what might come of it. Gentle laughter rippled through the crowd. Tonight, Thomas continued, I'm honored to announce the establishment of the Thornton Johnson Foundation for Musical Excellence, which will provide opportunities for gifted young musicians regardless of their background or circumstances. Mrs. Thornton looked genuinely surprised at the addition of her name to the foundation, and Beatrice covered her mouth in shock. With seed funding generously provided by Mrs. Eleanor Thornton, Thomas explained, and with my mother, Beatrice Johnson, serving as our community outreach director, we hope to build bridges for many other young musicians who might otherwise never have the chance to develop their gifts. The announcement was met with enthusiastic applause and immediate pledges of support from several guests. Later that evening, as the party wound down, Thomas found himself alone with his mother and Mrs. Thornton in the same study where, 10 years earlier, they had discussed his audition for the conservatory. You named the foundation after us, Beatrice said, still sounding amazed. You didn't tell me you were planning that. It seemed fitting, Thomas replied. Without both of you, none of this would have happened. Mrs. Thornton reached out to take Thomas's hand in her right and Beatrice's in her left. From the moment I heard you play, I knew you were special, Thomas. But I never imagined how much you would change all our lives. We changed each other's lives, Thomas corrected gently. That's what the music I played tonight was about. How connections between people can transform everything. Beatrice smiled at her son, her eyes shining with pride. Your father used to say that talent is God's gift to you, but what you do with it is your gift back to God. Thomas nodded thoughtfully. The foundation is just the beginning. There are so many children out there with gifts waiting to be discovered. And now, thanks to you, some of them will have their chance, Mrs. Thornton said. As they sat together in comfortable silence, Thomas thought about the unlikely journey that had brought them to this moment. A chance request, a hidden talent, and the courage to cross boundaries. These simple elements had combined to change not just his life, but potentially the lives of countless others. Outside the window, the first stars were appearing in the evening sky, just as they had on the night of his conservatory acceptance 10 years ago. But now, instead of facing an uncertain future alone, Thomas looked ahead with two extraordinary women by his side and a clear purpose in his heart. To build more bridges through the universal language of music, opening doors that had once seemed permanently closed.